You had the ridiculous spectacle of people like Chris Philp from the Tories having previously explicitly said that this is not about limiting free speech, and now you've got Tory shadow cabinet ministers having to actually come out and say that this bill is an outrage.
Trying to control the situation, they of course made it much worse. So if they had just been honest and treated British public like adults, then I think it would have been a very different response.
It's virtue signalling, but it's virtue signalling with morally depraved consequences. This is obviously going to be taken as a reward for terrorism.
Hello, and welcome back to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, thrilled as ever to be with Spike's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello.
And joining us today, stand-up comic and Free Speech Nation host, Josh Howie.
Hello.
Today, we'll be discussing the Online Safety Act, 1 year on from Southport, and the UK's recognition of a Palestinian state. So a major plank of the Online Safety Act came in last week. Age verification checks were rolled out.
Yeah. You're not allowed to masturbate unless you say verification properly. Yeah. That's what the new act is.
It's in the law.
Check you're old enough. So these age verification checks have been rolled out. I still can't say it.
You're going to have to buy you some magazines.
Back to Razzle for you.
Well, essentially, what the law is trying to do is to prevent young people from accessing harmful, potentially explicit material. But as we've learnt, most websites classify all of us as young people automatically. So vast swathes of the internet are now inaccessible. Lots of things have been taken down that are clearly not explicit, from political statements, including MP speeches. There's been footage of protests that have been taken down, and also some really quite anodyne things. I saw like the fashion menswear guy was taken down. An article about Keir Starmer, an article about the word or the name Keir dying out. There was no baby's name Keir last year. That was suppressed by the Online Safety Act.
I don't think it's making a comeback after this.
If anything, it's going to go into negative numbers. But
we all knew this act was an absolute authoritarian horror show, but it's proven even worse than we could have imagined.
And it's usually nice to be proven right, but not in this particular situation. I mean, anyone who's been looking at this bill, which was going through Parliament for many, many years before it eventually did, knew that these supposed attempts to crack down on what young people in particular could find online would basically lead to a situation in which everyone on the internet was operating on the kiddie settings kind of by default, and that's exactly what has happened. So you have all of these...
Let's take that out of context.
Exactly. Clip that off. And that's exactly what's happened. We've seen, whether it's social media platforms or whether it's the internet in general, it's now basically presuming, unless you're verifying your age, that there are certain material that you shouldn't be allowed to be exposed to because it might impact mental distress on the younger generations. That seems to extend from everything, as you've described, from speeches on grooming gangs through to even Goya paintings were censored as a consequence of this. And I think it's a reminder that there was a tremendous amount of complacency, or there was a tremendous amount of attempts from the last Tory government to suggest this was purely about protecting children. It was never going to have any knock-on effect. You had the ridiculous spectacle of people like Chris Philp from the Tories having previously explicitly said that this is not about limiting free speech. This will not limit free speech. And now you've got Tory shadow cabinet ministers having to actually come out and say that this bill is an outrage and it should be looked at again. So as you say, we all knew this was coming, but it's grim to be proven right in this instance.
And Josh, the people who've objected to the bill, including a certain Nigel Farage, have been dismissed as the government as friends of paedophiles. So Peter Carr, the tech secretary, said Farage, who's pledged to repeal the act should reform get into office, would have been enabling the Jimmy Saviles of our era. What do you make of that sort of hysterical response? It seems as if even though the problems are really very evident and have become evident instantaneously, they still can't accept that there could be free speech concerns.
Yeah, I mean, to resort to that level of rhetoric off the bat is a sort of almost a sign of desperation in and of itself. Maybe he was hoping that his paedophile comment, would be censored by it, so no one would actually see it. There could be like 4D chess going on, but yeah, it's a real problem if that's, and supposedly it did, that line came through the government.
Yeah,
so
they approved it.
They approved it.
And
it's, if that's their best argument, then that shows the weakness of the actual bill itself. And this is, yes, as you rightly said, this came through under the Tories. Now Labour pushed it over the line. There is a frustration because it was so obvious what was going to happen all the way through it. And the way that they did their wording, the way that they assumed that they made everybody, as you say, kidified, the way they sort of, the use of language like harm, inciting harm, everything. And now even their Ofcom's sort of supposed protections for free speech, which haven't really been enacted yet, are also sort of insanely weak. So this is the situation. It's only going to get worse. But I think critics calling out anybody who's trying to shame anybody speaking out against this bill as pedophiles just shows the sort of the level of intellect that you're dealing with.
Yeah, and it just seems Tom, there is really no one in the political class who is prepared to stand up for free speech, or is prepared to even make, mild criticisms of this bill when it was coming through. And even now, there's a few Johnny-come-latelys, but really the general mood is that this is essential. It's a good thing to control the internet. Free speech has got out of control anyway, is how they see it. Free speech is the problem.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And I think you do have politicians, and it's story as old as time, just kind of run scared whenever the argument of sort of think of the children is presented to them. This was very much packaged as trying to protect young people online, of which, of course, there are issues there which need to be addressed. The ease with which, teenagers, even younger, can access pornography these days is obviously something as a society that we need to deal with, whether there's technological fixes to that, whether there's cultural fixes to that in terms of parenting, whether there is some kind of neat legal things that could be explored, absolutely. But as soon as this bill began to be drafted, all kinds of things were attached to it. And also one thing that the government and successive governments now need to get their head around is, even if the aim seems quite straightforward and noble, that doesn't mean it's not going to have censorious consequences. You see that in relation to trying to introduce age verification, which is a problem in terms of it's actually not that difficult to get round. I mean, What was it? Proton had a 2,000% upsurge in downloads of their VPNs. It's pretty clear that a lot of young people, very tech savvy, are going to find ways around this. There's also the knock-on effect of it just essentially making the internet child-friendly by default, as we've discussed. And even some of the measures within the bill to make the social media companies in particular more proactive about taking down illegal content. We could talk about where the laws are, but even if we're talking about things which are using social media platforms to commit crimes and so on, things which might seem slightly less controversial, the experience of every government that's tried to do this, it just leads to overreaction, over censorship. You've got companies who don't want to fall foul of the law, don't want to be hit with incredibly exorbitant fines, and therefore they over-censor.
Or they just leave the market.
Absolutely, which is something, in terms of the point that you made, Josh, about things getting worse, you're now seeing loads of websites either on kind of smaller forums have already kind of shut down because they can't handle the compliance which is necessary. Wikipedia are threatening to leave the UK as a consequence of having to verify the identities of all of their moderators, which is something they're not happy to do. And there's all sorts of parts of this bill which will continue to be implemented over a period of time, which will continue to lead to a crackdown on privacy and free speech, and also potentially lead to a lot of these companies leaving. The scanning of encrypted messages, for example, which defeats the entire purpose of encryption, is something which is still very much in train and could easily lead to a situation in which either apps like WhatsApp or Telegram cease to have any purpose in terms of being able to protect your data and your messages and so on, or they just leave. So it'd be one thing if these were unforeseen consequences, but a lot of people who had looked at this in any detail could foresee them. They just didn't listen.
It'll be interesting to see what happens now in terms of it's quite a niche thing that this has been avenues that this has been talked about for years. Now that this is affecting normal people and more so, that's going to be interesting to see what people's reactions are. Now, we are here, I guess, to speak up for free speech. What I would like to see is a politician just being brave enough to come forward and just say, I just want to have a wank. That's like, and then take
without giving my credit card details.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know how. I don't want to go to my teenage son to ask how to do a VPN. I'm a normal bloke, and I just want a wank. And I feel like that political party has a real future in this country.
It's a shame that the wankers don't want to stand up and be counted, but that's where the government have got one over the populace.
You're going to see a lot of adult males getting more and more frustrated over the next, and lots of anger and testosterone. This is a very bad time for them to do it, by the way, as we head into sort of summer riot season.
That's true.
You don't want to keep men away from their.
There's enough pent-up aggression out there already.
Exactly.
And even though, even obviously, you know, there are ways around it. We're not banned from accessing material.
If you could
but
talk to me about it afterwards.
But the age verifiable.
Right, so let me just get my phone out. If you could just quickly.
But the sort of ID check tools that are in place are potentially quite dangerous for people's privacy. I mean, just think of the hacker that would love to have access to the names and, you know, photo IDs of all the people who have signed up.
And even things like internet
and
history
their viewing habits. And,
Yeah.
you know, this is, I mean, remember when the sort of Ashley Madsen website was hacked, for instance, and suddenly we knew everyone who was a cheater. This information is, you know, extraordinarily powerful, extraordinarily lucrative, could be in the hands of a hostile state. I mean, we know that the government just leaked, you know, tens of thousands of names of Afghan soldiers and our own spies. We know it's not in safe hands. This is very, very dangerous potentially.
And it's putting a hell of a lot of faith in the security measures and the moral stance of a lot of dodgy pornography websites in America and elsewhere to think that this will be introduced seamlessly. This is obviously a very difficult issue to crack. I mean, the kinds of ideas that came up before this were even, although less censorious, even more risible. I remember when Theresa May was in power, there was talk about you would actually have to go to like a corner shop and buy a porn pass in order to, in a brown paper bag, presumably, in order to access this. But it does seem that because there has been this difficulty within society with being able to keep children off of phones, being able to institute some level of security, part of that is the companies themselves not making these things easy, but also I think there's a tendency to act as if parents themselves can have no kind of say whatsoever in what their children see. That we've got to this place. But I think the other problem is as soon as you have a massive bill like this, there's going to be all kinds of different campaigners with all kinds of different agendas, some of them explicitly censorious, some of them well-meaning, but with censorious consequences, who just kind of flock to it. And you end up with a huge honking bill as we did that was always going to lead to this particular situation. But as Josh says, it will probably only get worse.
This episode of the Spike podcast is sponsored by Shopify. Running a small business can be hugely rewarding. But without the help of a marketing department, graphic designers and accountants, you can sometimes feel like you're on your own and you don't know how to grow. That's where Shopify comes in. Shopify is the commerce platform supporting millions of businesses all over the world, from small brands just getting started to established household names like Mattel and Gymshark. Shopify is who they trust to take their business to the next level. With Shopify, there's no need to learn tricky technical skills like graphic design or coding. Shopify's own design studio comes with hundreds of ready-to-use templates that speak to your brand from the start. If you need a snappy headline or sales pitch, Shopify's handy AI tools can generate polished content for your business at the touch of a button. It can even help you build social media campaigns to keep your customers in the loop. You'll feel like you've got a whole team behind you, even if you're the only person in your business. And the best part yet, Shopify offers world-class expertise on everything from supply chain management to international shipping. Whatever your business's needs are, you can rest easy in the knowledge that Shopify's got your back. If you're ready to sell, you're ready for Shopify. Turn your big business idea into cash with Shopify on your side. Sign up for your £1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.co.uk/spiked. Go to shopify.co.uk/spiked. That's shopify.co.uk/spiked. So a year ago this week, Axel Rudikubana travelled to a dance class in Southport, Merseyside, and murdered 3 young girls. In the days afterwards, we saw some of the worst racial rioting that England has seen in decades. Tom, should we start off talking about this despicable, inexplicable crime? Because as tragic as it is, this is something that should have been prevented. Axel Rudikubana set off so many red flags, and none of them were really followed up.
No, absolutely. I think it became the line that was trotted out, which is that Rudikubana slipped through the net, which I think is completely incorrect. He was caught in the net multiple times. It's just nothing was ever done about it. I mean, people know about the fact that he was referred to prevent on 3 separate occasions the kind of counter-radicalisation scheme, and yet was each time assessed and then essentially let loose again because of the fact that they couldn't pin him down to a specific ideology. He just seemed to be generally obsessed with violence. He had material on everything from IRA bombings through to genocide, through to Islamist terrorism. He, of course, was in possession of that Al-Qaeda training manual, but because they couldn't neatly fit him into one of these boxes, kind of computer said no, and that was it. I mean, that being said, Prevent is a relatively weak scheme in the grand scheme of things. He also had contact with the police. He was caught with knives on multiple occasions. He admitted to taking knives to school, and I think up to about 10 occasions at one particular point. He attacked a classmate with a hockey stick. He admitted, I think, to Childline at one point that he wanted to kill someone. I mean, this is
and he had a knife at the time, and he had planned to use it
at the time he broke that kid's wrist. Absolutely. So, and time again, it was of no consequence. Nothing was actually done. And part of that is just going to be incompetent systems failing and whatever. But you put that together with the number of horrific murders which have taken place, either as a consequence of mentally deranged individuals, Valdo Calacane in Nottingham a few years ago, stabbing 3 people to death, or many of the Islamist terrorists, David Amos's murderer, who again was assessed by Prevent, and his assessor came to the conclusion that he was a nice young man and nothing else needed to be done. So when people say that they feel like the state is absolutely failing to keep people safe, even when there is red flag after red flag after red flag, this unfortunately is the most extreme and grim example of that, I would say.
And this time last year, Josh, when the news was spreading about this horrible crime, we didn't know the identity of the perpetrator. We didn't know the motive. We didn't really understand what was going on. But in that void, the police were, very keen not to say anything or divulge any details, and have been criticised for their sort of reticence to say what happened. Into that void came this misinformation that he was a Muslim asylum seeker, and in that context, all hell seemed to break loose.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of proves how necessary it is for there to be this free speech, for there to be this openness. Because if that information was available from the get-go, if they had just come out and instead of trying to control the situation, they of course made it much worse.
Yeah,
because they allowed that space and they allowed bad faith actors and rumors to enter it. So if they had just been honest and treated the British public like adults, then I think it would have been a very different response than what happened. So it's whether that lesson has truly been learned or will ever be learned. I don't know. Obviously, our rulers just think we're idiots.
Yeah, definitely. And Tom, the rioting, I think sometimes misremembered for how shocking it was. Some of the racial violence that was being meted out. There were protests, but these were not just protests.
No, absolutely. And the full extremity of it is horrifying when you relive it. There was obviously the attack on the mosque in Southport. There was attacks on mosques up and down the country. There was the attempts in Rotherham and elsewhere to push, burning wheelie bins into asylum hotels whilst blocking the emergency exits. Reports in other parts of the country of masked youths running around Asian areas, screaming racial slurs and smashing up windows. I mean, this was a real despicable, really disquieting upsurge in ethnic conflict and violence. It was obviously amongst an infinitesimally small section of the population. But that's something which obviously needs to be condemned. But I think, as we were talking about on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, in relation to, as we were approaching the anniversary of the riots, that's also obviously insufficient in trying to explore why society has come apart to the extent that it has, why we have created this space for extreme bigoted attitudes to curdle amongst the fringes. And I stress that the fringes rather than the broader sweep of society. That's something which really needs to be engaged with. The problem that we got after Southport was you had the establishment doing what it always does, which is blaming social media. The problem here is social media. The problem is that Elon Musk let Tommy Robinson back on, or the problem is that misinformation, full stop, was the issue. First of all, it's facile to suggest that free speech is in and of itself the problem if there are broader structural endemic problems within society which might have created this situation or at least exacerbated it. But it also has all these kind of censorious consequences. We did see that post-Southport riot crackdown. We did see the message coming from the very top of government, social media accounts, gov.uk screaming out, think before you post in the context of those riots. You had the Director of Public Prosecutions going on the news saying that even sharing potentially inflammatory material from the riots could lead to you being arrested. And we saw obviously very heavy sentences being meted out to people who, granted, tweeted absolutely or posted absolutely despicable things, Lucy Connolly being the most famous case of this. But it just seemed to get this problem entirely the wrong way around, as if I think what we saw in the wake of Southport was a refusal to look more deeply as to why this has happened, but also this recourse to, well, if the social media companies just tougher up their algorithms, if we just lock up more people, then this would never have happened. That's both obviously censorious in its impact, but also facile and a kind of displacement activity.
But it's also the opposite lesson, because you could argue that so much of the anger there, the frustration there, and again, to condemn where it goes into violence, and but was based though on a very real sense of gaslighting of decades of it, really. And that response was partly to that feeling of, again, being lied to and trying to be controlled for this greater good, but it having really the opposite impact.
No, absolutely. And it's worth saying that in terms of the people who were arrested for speech, there's a lot of those cases which we'll continue to learn about, I think. I mean, there's one gentleman, we interviewed him for Spike recently in a format that we'll release at some point in the future. Jamie Michael in Wales, who was brought up on charges of inciting racial hatred for a video that he posted after Southport. This was around the time that misinformation was circulating. He was talking about there being radicalised people in the asylum hotels, and he was just calling for the need for a public meeting, that we need security at schools, that we need security at parks, that we need to do something about illegal migration because it's a threat, which even absent Southport and the misinformation is clearly the case. If you look at the kinds of crimes that many people who have entered the country illegally have gone on to commit, he was hauled over the coals. I mean, he was arrested. He was thrown in custody for 17 days. He was only allowed home on a tag. It was only because of his own bloody mindedness that he pleaded not guilty, unlike many other people who were given the kind of standard police-provided solicitor who just told them to plead guilty in the hopes of a shorter sentence. And then because of that, the Free Speech Union found out about him, got the tag taken off. It actually went to trial, and he was acquitted in 17 minutes. He told us that his tea that he was drinking didn't even have time to cool before they were called back in to hear the verdict. So unanimous and swift was it that he clearly wasn't inciting hatred. And I think there'll be many more cases like that of people who were swept up in that really censorious, really extreme atmosphere, which was whipped up from the very top after those riots.
Definitely. And finally, Josh, it does feel like British society is still in a dire place. You know, a year on from those riots, we've had protests around the asylum hotel issue in Epping. We've had some near here where we're recording in Canary Wharf. There's still a kind of growing public anger with the establishment. A lot of those sort of underlying problems that gave fuel to this have not been anywhere close to resolved. Maybe they're even worse.
No, because it's anybody who dares have any fears or concerns about illegal migration or any, it's still said to be far right, essentially. And I watched the video that you guys did around the corner, and I think that is as frustrating for people, this accusation of being far right, as the actual issue of young men coming and living near their homes who may not, arguably follow the same cultural norms. I'm saying it in the nicest possible way, but the fear for their children and daughters, and so that I think that is as much a motivating factor for that feeling of unrest, because it would be nice, I think, if people could just sort of want to feel listened to, ultimately, not accused of something.
So Keir Starmer has pledged to recognise a Palestinian state at this September's United Nations General Assembly. His recognition comes after President Macron, who didn't really set out any
another great statesman.
He didn't really set out any conditions, but Keir Starmer has used this kind of as a threat against Israel. He said that if Israel doesn't essentially agree to an enduring ceasefire, if it doesn't commit to a two-state solution, then the UK will unilaterally recognise Palestine. He has sort of flip-flopped on whether there are conditions on Hamas, which is, you think
quite important.
The more difficult party to wrangle in, but there you go. What have you made of this, Tom?
Well, I think it's the kind of lightest assessment of it is that it's virtue signalling, but it's virtue signalling with morally depraved consequences. I mean, not only in terms of the blackmail which is being inflicted on a state which is supposed to be an ally, which was nominally supposed to be in support of in its war against a genocidal terrorist outfit, but also because of the fact that this is obviously going to be taken as a reward for terrorism. The sequence of it is undeniable. You have Hamas commit the biggest assault on Jews since the Holocaust, murdering 1,200 people, taking 250 hostages, a pogrom of kind of genocidal intent that took place on that day, on October 7th, 2023. You then have Hamas recourse to what it always does, which is to put its own civilians in harm's way in order to maximise casualties, to try and maximise its propaganda efforts to curry favour with the useful idiot spread all across the world. And then you have, as a consequence of that, a selection of Western states decide to say, now is the time to reward this behaviour with statehood. I mean, it's absolutely horrendous. I mean, it's one of those things where it even kind of grates against the supposedly legalistic tendencies of Keir Starmer. There's been a number of senior legal figures in the House of Lords who've written this letter now saying that actually this would be in contravention of international law in terms of how you would normally go about recognising a state, because there are no agreed upon borders. There is no stable leadership with which to do business. These are details which even the supposedly international law loving Keir Starmer and Lord Hermer are just looking past and completely ignoring. The questions are obvious. What possible leverage you are going to try to use against Hamas? The idea that they're just going to lay down arms and refuse to have any part in a future Palestinian state just because Keir Starmer asked them to doesn't make any sense. Who are supposed to be the kind of the prospective government of a future Palestinian state? You've obviously got Hamas on one side, and then you've got the Palestinian Authority led by Mahmoud Abbas in the West Bank, who is currently 20 years into his 4-year term, hated by the population, and is refusing to hold elections precisely because he's concerned that Hamas would win a future election. So it's one of those things where all of these details are deemed irrelevant because Keir Starmer, hated on the domestic scene, wants to posture on the international stage. And it's not even obvious that even if he was doing it for cynical political manoeuvring reasons, that it would have any effect whatsoever. The left of the Labour Party is not impressed by this. They already see him absurdly as some kind of collaborator in genocide. The inner city, say, British Muslim populations who abandoned the Labour Party at the last election over Gaza are not going to be impressed by this. The only people who seem to be welcoming it was that one Hamas former health minister who said this is fantastic because it's putting us on course to a Palestinian state. So it was one of those things where, who is this for? Who is this impressing? So far, the only person we can say is Hamas, definitively. And why he's going down this course, we can understand the cynical or perhaps kind of moralistic reasons for it. But it's very predictable, as Josh's original reaction would indicate. But nevertheless, it's grim that we've come to this point.
Yeah, I mean, we've been sort of moving towards this point, I guess. Keir Starmer's tried to signal, nudge and a wink that he wants to do this, but keeps saying he wants to maximise the impact of recognition. But surely, all he's done is maximise the amount of offence that he's caused to any, decent-minded people.
Look, I don't know much about this, okay, guys? But, no, this is, there's so many angles in this that are totally insane. You've covered a whole bunch of them, and one of them being this afternoon, a government spokesman came out and said, oh, well, we're not putting any conditions on Hamas because we don't deal with terrorists. Like, it's a noble, look at us, we're the UK, we don't deal with, so we're going to put the conditions on our democratic ally, like, instead. That's who gets the conditions. And as you said as well, like this idea it's going to make any impact on the ground is ridiculous. Like, the UK has any real power. If anything, arguably, the UK do better out of that relationship with Israel. I heard from someone who knew someone who was used to work in the security services. Basically, without Mossad, we would be screwed. Without that information coming in, and also just looking at where in terms of Israeli weapons and development and R&D, it's like to mess with them as an ally, it hurts the UK more, arguably, and also just in terms of pissing off Trump. For it's such a, so if it's not going to make an impact over there, then it's purely about UK politics and the cynicism of it, and what a stupid decision it is. It sort of baffles me. I mean, someone says, there's that saying, Starmer, but anybody, he's clever but an idiot or whatever. It's like that. It had to not be able to read the situation. In terms of how it's all accelerated, my personal theory is just sort of seeing it play out in real time was the Hamas have just been sort of pumping out propaganda for even, since the beginning, but over the last year and a bit, particularly of these kids with disabilities, with congenital diseases or conditions. And if there was starvation, this starvation narrative has been an ongoing thing, but it just built up so much. Oh, and it's not to say that there wasn't genuine hardship.
Yeah.
But in terms of this idea that of people actually starving to death, everyone's got a mobile phone out there. You would see you've still got all these obese adults. You'd see it. And all we saw and all we have seen are these photos of these kids with these conditions. So I personally think that where the Rubicon got crossed was the Express putting that picture on the front page last week with a kid in a plastic like black bin liner as a nappy, which actually is in itself fake because there's loads of photos of him with nappies from the same photo shoot. And then because of that, and the Express, which is, I guess, it's seen as a sort of right-wing paper, but the idea that for me was that crossing a line, then it sort of gave they know that these photos are they're not fake, but they are
misrepresented.
And then of course it gave everybody permission to do that. Even the Daily Mail did this massive feature about them. No one actually revealing that this kid, to anyone who's got eyes, and certainly to anyone who has any understanding of the conflict, would go, that's a child with medical conditions. And then obviously and then the New York Times, and then they put it on as well. They put out a little tiny thing to their sub account yesterday with that they've got 55 million followers or something like that, and they put it out to their 55,000 or something. It's like they just try to hide this little thing, like, oh, by the way, we just found out that they've got this medical. So anyway, the point is that it feels like you could feel the swell of this false narrative taking over to the point where it either Starmer felt that, and the rest of the government felt that this was the time to exploit that, or they couldn't resist it any further. Yeah. And that's what it feels like.
And there were was it over 200 MPs had written a letter, a third of Starmer's cabinet, and he's obviously a prime minister who has no authority anymore. So it seemed that on this issue, like many others, he was just bound to buckle, but with, as you said, with quite terrible consequences. It's extremely morally depraved what he has decided to do.
Absolutely. And I think the tendency to make incredibly historically important foreign policy decisions, I mean, it's not going to have an immediate impact on the ground, shall we say, but in terms of a shift in terms of where the British government stands on the question of Israel and Palestine, this is very significant. Just on the basis of domestic political consumption is a horrific way to conduct yourself. I think it's something that supposedly the wiser heads, supposedly, of the Labour Party, freed from ideology and whatnot of either the Brexiteers or the Corbynistas, they were supposedly not going to engage in such kind of shallow politics. But time and time again, you have politicians who are weak, who are disliked on the domestic front, who turn to the international stage in order to try and get plaudits, a sense of mission, a sense of substance. And it seems like whether or not this is actually the right thing to do proves secondary to that in this case as in many others.
And it's going to be the opposite. Of course, it's the opposite thing to do. I should say, I am Jewish. I somewhat have skin in the game. I want there to be two states.
Yeah.
But of course, under this circumstance, these circumstances is ridiculous because you still have 50% of the Palestinian population supporting Hamas, supporting what happened October 7th. There has to be a radical de-radicalization of the general population. We are still dealing Hamas, they are jihadist Islamists. It's a religious war for them. And we are here in the West putting our little sort of blinkers on about how, it's like Ireland, or it's like, it's not the same thing. For them, it's a religious war. And it all comes down to the fact that, and I'm certainly not the first person to say this by any means, but once the Palestinians want their own state more than they want to the end of a Jewish state, they will get a state. And it really does come down to that. And he surely must know that. So it just makes the cynicism like 1,000 times worse. That's not going to help what's going on with the hostages. It's not going to help the Palestinians until there's this actual realization of what the problem is.
Yeah.
You can't, this is not the solution by any means.
Yeah.
Very annoying.
Thank you so much for watching the Spiked podcast. We'll be back at the same time next week. In the meantime, why not subscribe to Spike's YouTube channel and then click the bell so you're always alerted whenever there's some new content. Spiked is producing more videos than ever, from podcasts like this one to interviews to our series of polemics. You really, really don't want to miss out on it. Plus, to get your daily dose of Spiked, just go to spiked-online.com. That's our website at spiked-online.com.